Hey everyone, hope you're all well. It's getting to the end of summer here in Cambridge, and I hope like everyone's taking the maximum advantage of the sun in summer and recharging. So today I wanted to do like a very short video on like a topic which is slightly controversial but also like very important to examine from like a linguist perspective. So this is about accents and dialects and also like variation in language. So yeah, so this is like a very you know widely discussed topic. So I think the main motivation for me, the stimulus to do this video came yesterday. I saw a post on LinkedIn in which they were discussing a viral video which basically was about like a group of Indian American women in Texas who were like being I would say, like, I don't know what's the right word to use, who were being like bullied or shamed for their accent, for the Indian accent, right? So yeah, so firstly that's very unfortunate, and that's something that's like it's really biased behavior, which is you know which cannot be overlooked. But then this whole issue of accent needs to be examined from from the perspective of like what linguistics has to say about this. So yeah, I get it that language is something, it's universal, everyone uses it, so everyone has opinions about it. But then there is also like a perspective coming from an academic discipline that specializes in this field, right? So if you want to talk about gravity, it's affecting all of us, but then we need to sort of like refer back to the scientific principles, and you don't want to ignore that knowledge, right? So the same way with linguistics, you don't want to ignore what the discipline has to say about linguistic variation and all of these things which are related to this topic. So the first thing I want to say is, let's try to understand the term accent, right? So when people say accent, they are mostly referring to like dialects. So there are like many regional dialects in any language, not just English, right? So it's not just English which has this feature. So you have also like social registers, like you have class dialects, right? So you have like an upper class dialect versus a working class dialect, and furthermore you can have like specific occupations can have like dialects. So there can be like a fisherman's dialect, or there can be like, I don't know, all kinds of specialized social registers. So this is like social linguistics 101. So we learn that language, when you say English, it's referring to all of these varieties. So English is just like a cover term that you're using to refer to all these varieties. So it's the same for any language. It's the same for Telugu, my mother tongue. It's the same for like Tamil. It's the same for Hindi. It's the same for like Portuguese. And in the case of in the case of European languages, it's even more complex, because some of these languages like Portuguese are like spread across continents. So you have Brazilian Portuguese, you have European Portuguese, and again you'll have so many variants within like Brazil, right? So that's very important to realize that when you're talking about accent, mostly people are referring to like the dialect that people are speaking, the regional dialect. And how do people acquire accents? So it's because like you grow up in that region, or you live in that region for long enough, and you sort of adapt to the dialect of that community that you're living in, of that speaker community, and you tend to have those features, and that's how people distinguish your speech as having that accent or belonging to that dialect. Yeah, so this is one of the main problems. So accent in linguistics has a very different meaning. So accent is actually referring to the stress patterns right? So like primary accent, secondary accent, pitch accents. So this is the technical meaning of accent. But then in the real world, so when people say, oh, you have an accent or you speak with an accent, what they mean is like, oh, you speak this regional variety or you speak this particular class register, right? So that's one of the most important distinctions. And this is true of all languages. Okay, so like this is a big, this is a slightly controversial point. So like there is a lot of criticism that, okay, as if this is something English specific and this is something like imposed upon people by the colonial, whatever, like the period, which is not true, right? Like, I mean, colonialism has done a lot of damage, but this is something, if you think about it scientifically, it's actually universal. Every language has it. So even if you go to the remotest like tribe in Africa, or like, let's say, I would say like Papua New Guinea, right, which has it's one of the uh, most diverse places on earth, linguistically diverse places on earth. So even there you have these kind of issues where like one dialect is considered the standard, and one dialect is sort of like, so there are multiple dialects and they're often competing for prestige, right? And it's advantageous if like speakers speak the high prestige variety. Yeah, so like I can give you an example from from India. So like, for example, if you look at the history of Telugu, right? So that's my mother tongue. So the whole over the last, so one decade back, exactly like 2014, the whole Telugu speaking region it used to be one state and it was divided into two states, and now there is demand for like even more states. And the main reason, if you look at I mean, I don't want to get into the politics, but the main reason was dialect prestige. So the Telangana dialect was considered to be sort of like funny, and it was portrayed as funny in mainstream movies and mainstream media, and this was like one of the main reasons why they had that sort of movement in the first place, that self-respect, etc. So this is something which predates colonialism. This is something which is not specific to English, right? So let's not be confused about that. Let's not blame colonialism for everything. So yeah, I might be sounding strange here, but yeah, so I usually often say critical things about colonialism and imperialism and linguistics, but this is something where that doesn't apply, or even if it does apply, it's a very um, restricted sort of phenomena. So yeah, so like if you talk about dialects of English, yeah, maybe there is, the prestige was reinforced by colonialism. So you have like RP, received pronunciation, which is very high prestige, and then so the whole thing of like My Fair Lady, right? Pygmalion, George Bernard Shaw. So there is some of that which came from like the colonialism, but much of it is universal. It applies to all languages of the world. So the other thing is also like, the point of bias. Is there bias against Indian English, right? So again, we have to be really careful when we examine this. So there are two aspects again, if you ask me. There is one is like the dialect that you are speaking. So if there is bias against Indian English as a dialect, then that's bad. And the second is also the skill level of the individual speakers, right? So I mean, no one's talking about that. So like language, if there's a lot of people also saying that, oh, English is just a skill, it's like a professional skill, it's not like a marker of prestige, which is true, right? But if it's a skill, then you also need to think about the level of skill that you have, right? So you can say like, I mean, it's well known that there are different levels of skill when you speak a language: beginner, intermediate, advanced, fluent, whatnot. The most important thing is when someone says that you're like, your language is, I can't comprehend your language, or you're really difficult to follow. It could be both these things. It could be also be that like your skill level is not really up to the mark, and there is some upskilling for you to do. So yeah, so I'll give you another example, right? So I moved from India to the US, right? Specifically like Boston, right? I mean Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I lived there for a few years. Then I moved to California for a year, and then I moved to Dublin, and then I moved to the UK. I'm now in Cambridge, and all these moves, I had to like sort of adapt to the regional speech, you know speech variety that is spoken there, right? So like for example, when I came to Cambridge, I kind of like noticed that there are stock phrases here which I didn't know. So like for example, out in the sticks and out of the sticks, and like I'll get cracking on, and so all of these things, I didn't know these expressions, so I had to sort of like understand how they are being used so that I can comprehend what they are saying, and then I can also like communicate in a way that's, so that sort of upskilling you have to do, right? So this is just like learning Python and upskilling. You work on a new project, and then you have to upskill. So that part, I think we should not have, like we shouldn't confuse that with like the bias aspect, right? So if so, and this, the reason I'm saying this is not because I'm like denying bias, but there is a serious problem. The problem is, in the Indian education system, languages and humanities are sort of like systematically ignored. All the emphasis is on STEM. So I remember, like when I was in school, I was very interested in reading literature. So I used to read like, so I used to just when my parents asked me, hey, sit down and read some books, then I would always pick the English textbook, or like the Hindi textbook, or like the Telugu textbook. So I actually didn't study Telugu formally. It was all like self-taught, and my parents taught me. So I used to pick up those books and read them. And then, I mean, inevitably the criticism was, oh, why are you studying these things? Like, why don't you focus on maths, physics, chemistry? So I know where this starts. I'm not making this up. I know exactly. So yeah, so if Indians are watching this, so what I'd like to say is, don't get offended or triggered by what I'm saying. I know where this starts. It starts very much in the formative years. You don't value, the education system has been sort of like off balance for a long time. So you're not valuing humanities, you're not valuing languages. So therefore, you don't have the requisite skills. And therefore, like, when you, and then when you like immigrate to the US, or even if you work like for an American company in India, the Indian call centers are like, I mean, very famous by now. And I think that is part of the reason why we have this bad reputation, why Indians have this bad reputation. Because, a disgruntled customer in the US gives a call, and, they're already sort of like annoyed about something, and they give a call, and then they're answered by this, speaker of Indian English, who is unable to follow what they are saying, and who is unable to give them the help they need. So this sort of like has a blowback effect. So there is this bias. So I'm not saying that the bias is okay, but what I'm saying is that there is also this deficit in terms of skills. So I speak Indian English, and I've been speaking, and I've been, I managed in the US, I managed in Ireland, I managed in the UK. Okay, I ran into biased people once in a while, but nobody told me that, you're not fit enough to do a job, or you're not fit enough to. I've like written research papers, and I've written like multiple theses. So nowhere was I told that, your English isn't good enough. So it's a lot to do with skills as well, right? So let's not forget that. Let's not just like say that, okay, it's all bias. There is severe bias. There is a little bit of bias. I mean, there are biased individuals, but there is no like systematic bias. If there was system, so let's not forget that English is also like one of the biggest advantages for Indians, because we have this tradition of English medium education. That's how like most of these people were able to migrate to the West, and they were able to establish themselves in the Silicon Valley and whatnot. So it's like, it's also an advantage, and you can't have it both ways. You can't say that, okay, when it suits me, it's like all fine and dandy. And once I get some comments that, okay, your English is hard to comprehend, I mean, obviously, like, these are different sets of people, the ones who are getting these comments. And, so I'm not saying that, like, it's okay for people to attack others based on the accent. But the most important thing I'm saying is, let's have a very, logical and scientific viewpoint on this. So accent is the regional dialect. And if you grew up in India speaking that dialect, so you will have that. And the main difference in terms of like dialects is in the phonology. So phonology is like the speech sounds, like the pronunciation. In terms of grammar, syntax, there is slight, differences, but almost negligible, because you can, communicate even with those small differences in like sentence structure. But the major issue is with respect to pronunciation. Okay. And what do I think about like accent trainers? So yeah, so again, so accent training is like very ambiguous, right? Like, so what I would say is like English skill training, right? Like that's actually required, that's completely, legitimate. But it's impossible to sort of like change the dialect. So if you try, I mean, it's you can try, and you can sort of like pick a new dialect. That's not the thing that's impossible. But what I mean is, there is no need to all of us to sort of like start speaking with like a RP accent. So it will happen naturally. So if you move to that region and you start adapting to the speech habits of the community, you will sort of like pick some stock phrases, as I have. And you will also, your pronunciation will also change, your intonation will naturally change over a period of time. But more importantly, you need to make a distinction between the dialect and the skills. So skills, you might have to upskill in order to do the job that you have to do. And that's something which has nothing to do with like you're having an Indian accent or speaking Indian English as your regional variety, right? So that's as your native language, I mean. So that's completely like, these are two tangential issues. Okay, so I hope this kind of gives some clarity about the issue. I actually had a lot more to say, but this was more like an impromptu video to kind of like add to the discussion. And yeah, I mean, like, I don't understand like the emotions running so high on this topic. It's something which is like there in all languages. And yeah, so it's not specific to English. If any language you pick, there are these kinds of issues. So yeah, so let's bear that in mind. Hope you have a nice time. Bye bye, until next time. Bye.